Hello, and thank you for joining us for preparing for transition IEP meetings. My name is Ann Wilson, and I coordinate our ADR, or Alternative Dispute Resolution project at Peak Parent Center. And I'm also the parent of a student with an IEP who happens to be in transition now. I'll be presenting tonight with Allison Parrish, who is one of CDE's special education facilitators, as well as a former educator, and she'll tell you a little bit more about facilitation. Our presentation will focus on secondary transition tonight, meaning preparing to leave high school, which is something that we encourage families to think about from early ages. I'm going to go over a few items to help you participate in today's webinar. Please remain muted during the presentation. If you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat. We're not able to answer questions specific to your personal situation in the webinar, but one-to-one support is available through Peak, CDE, and Show and Tell, and I'll tell you more about them at the end of the presentation. To view the live transcript, click the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Spanish interpretation is available. You can access that using the globe at the bottom of your screen. And be aware that this session is being recorded and will be posted to our website for viewing later. Peak partners with CDE's Alternative Dispute Resolution project to help families and educators learn more about facilitation and facilitative skills. The project is intended to support communication, collaboration, and the early resolution of disagreements. We acknowledge that there are conflicts where the dispute resolution processes provided under IDEA are needed. Peak Parent Center is a training and information center and does not provide legal advice or legal services. This webinar is provided for informational purposes only. And there is a Google folder with slides and resources, and let me see if I can copy this. I forgot to copy the link for you to access that if you want to access it, but hopefully you can use the QR code to access the folder, and that has the slides and the resources that we'll mention in this webinar. Our agenda for tonight, first we'll start out with Allison telling you a little bit more about CDE's ADR project and facilitation. We'll talk about transition planning. We'll talk about family participation in transition planning, a quick look at transition assessments, what they are, and then some tools to enhance your parent and student input, and then we'll end with resources. I like to just go over the acronyms that we'll be using tonight. Some of these are in the presentation and some of them are in the resources later. ADR is Alternative Dispute Resolution. CDE, the Colorado Department of Education. CMA stands for Case Management Agency, and that's who you work with when you're using a Medicaid waiver. You may be familiar with CCBs, or Community Center Boards, and those have gone through a transition, and so you will likely be working with a case management agency now. DVR is the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation. FAPE, Free Appropriate Public Education. IDEA, or IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and then the IEP, your Individualized Education Program. So we'll start with Allison talking about CDE's ADR project and facilitation.
Thank you, Anne. Yes, my name is Allison Parrish. I am one of the special education facilitators through CDE, and I first want to tell you a little bit about what the ADR project is, and it is a collaboration between CDE and Peak Parent. And I'm going to talk about some benefits and the hurdles that we see with special education. The benefits of special education opens doors of possibilities for students and helps kids grow up to be part of society. It provides the opportunity to a quality education that aligns with an individual's unique needs. And the most powerful aspect of special education is the multidisciplinary team approach to assess a student's strengths and needs. So each member of that multidisciplinary team brings their unique lens and important information to the meeting to support the team's understanding of the student and what services that student needs. Next slide. Most of the disagreements or hurdles in special education impact the development of the IEP. We are also seeing that smaller issues arise or show up when we're in the IEP meetings, the actual team meetings. This may be because it is the time when all the adults are together sitting around the table. There is a natural imbalance of power that exists that can cause parents to feel undervalued and/or uncomfortable in the IEP process. We also know that when we get to disagreements, members of the team, whether it be school staff, administrators, and/or families, often become focused on the disagreement and the unresolved conflict, therein straining the relationship. And conflict can be expensive. It is expensive in dollars, but even more importantly, it's a cost to that relationship of the IEP team members and the impact of these negative relationships to the student and their ability to access an education. In 2018, although it's several years old, we do have a dollar value there that school districts spent over $90 million in conflict resolution. Because we've seen a higher number of dispute resolution and mediation and state complaints, we know that number is higher because we are seeing that trend across the country. Next slide. We have seen an increase. This graph shows the mediation, state complaints, due process, and facilitation. And we have seen a steady increase among all ADR opportunities. Due process has remained pretty level. And although we don't have a number specific to facilitations for 2024 at this time, or 2023 at this time, we can say right now we have seen about a 30% increase in that. As required by IDEA, CDE offers parents access to IDEA funded mediation, state complaints, and due process. That fourth option, as mentioned, which is facilitation, is not a requirement under IDEA, but we are seeing it as a growing and promising practice. Most states have this as an option for IEP meetings. Next slide. CDE wanted to provide an alternative support system to families more than what was provided under IDEA. So this is when the ADR project really started in 2013, 2014. And the mission is to provide a funded support system and toolbox of options for all special education stakeholders in order to increase a more collaborative IEP process and positive relationships. Stakeholders could be, or I should say, stakeholders are CDE staff, the Peak Parent Center, advocates, parent attorneys, parents, and others in the educational field, such as special education directors. Next slide. From this project, facilitation was brought to the state. Facilitation is optional and, as mentioned earlier, is not something required under IDEA. It is voluntary, and any member of the IEP team, whether that be the parents, special education teacher, an advocate, a district director, or a related service provider, can request facilitation, but both of the district and the family must agree to that facilitation. Facilitation promotes effective communication and participation, and there is no cost to either the parent or the school district. Facilitation is available for any type of special education meeting. Next slide. To request facilitation, the easiest way is to Google search CDE ADR, and it says 2024 facilitation request link. Once you click on that, there is a form to complete, and that will be sent to our office. We then confirm agreement from all parties, and a facilitator will be assigned to support your next meeting. Next slide. So our focus tonight is the transition IEP. And after spending almost 25 years in special education as a teacher, 23 of which were spent at the high school level, I have a lot of experience supporting students and families with transition. Next slide. So when we're planning for transition IEP meetings, something to mention and not to be confused, a meeting about transitioning from one program to another is also called a transition meeting, but that is not the type of meeting that we're talking about tonight. Our focus really is that secondary transition in looking at post-secondary goals. So beginning at age 15 or can begin earlier, secondary transition planning is part of the annual IEP process. This is also the time students must be invited to their IEP meetings. It is important that transition assessments are holistic and give a complete picture of the child. This is also a time to get connected with outside agencies. These agencies can provide support outside of school. And should an agency be invited to a meeting, parents must provide their consent. Adult agencies can be sources of funding, services, and/or support, and there is a link to the Google folder that provides more information about that. Next slide. Transition planning, when you have your students' IEP meetings beginning at that age of 15 or by the end of their 9th grade year, teams will emphasize post-secondary transition. Goals will be related to a student's post-secondary goals in training, education, employment, and independent living. We will talk about some of those assessments and how that information is used later in this presentation. Next slide. Transition follows the same process in the IEP, such as all process for IEP, starting with the evaluation and looking at transition assessments to identify needs, present levels, to then support the identification and working of goals and whatever accommodations, modifications, and services benefit that student for transition. Transition assessments help the team gather information and data to determine a student's present level related to post-secondary education, employment, and independent living. The IEP will contain post-secondary goals and coordinated transition activities and services. And again, adult agencies may be invited with parent consent. Next slide. Transition services includes courses and classes to assist a student in reaching their post-secondary goals and a coordinated set of activities in these areas of instruction, related services, community experience, and the development of employment and daily living skills. Next slide. Any student with an IEP can access the 18 to 21 services through their school district. They may have met the minimum requirements for graduation in their districts, but it is not required. The student may have ongoing transition needs identified in their IEPs. Students who have met the minimum requirements may participate in a social graduation, but cannot accept the diploma should they want to receive the district's 18 to 21 services. FAPE ends once the diploma has been received by the student. There is a link to CDE's website for additional information regarding what that transition looks like. Next slide. And then preparing for what is ahead. At age 18, students are considered an adult and have adult rights and responsibilities, including educational privacy and healthcare rights, decision-making, voting, selective service for males, adult waivers, and benefits. After IDEA, which is once that student receives their diploma, FAPE ends, free education opportunities are limited, attending school all day on school days usually ends. Individuals will need to identify and seek out accommodations and/or assistance, and the shift is made from progress to access. Next slide. From the 2023 World Economic Forum Future of Jobs report, the top 10 job skills on the rise include critical thinking, analytical thinking, technological literacy, curiosity and lifelong learning, resilience, flexibility, and agility, systems thinking, AI and big data, motivation and self-awareness, talent management, and service orientation and customer service. I'm now going to turn it back over to Anne.
Thank you, Allison. And give me just a second, oh, there it went. Okay. My advanced arrow just disappeared on my screen. So I'm going to talk about family participation in transition planning, which I think is very important. And first, why do we have family participation in transition planning? It's the same reason we have family participation in the IEP process. It's a requirement of IDEA. And the reason that it is a requirement of IDEA is because there's research and evidence that having this role really helps have better outcomes for the students. So it's based in strong research and it's part of the law. But when you start to talk about transition, the student must be invited to the transition IEP team meeting. So when you're having an IEP meeting where there's post-secondary goals and transition services will be considered, then you need to invite the student. And that has to happen starting at age 15, but it could happen earlier. And we hope that the students will attend, but if for some reason the student is not able to attend the meeting, then the IEP team must consider the student's interests and plans for after high school. And so both the parent and student input is important in transition. For some students, this may be the first time they've participated in the IEP meeting. That really varies from family to family and school to school. So thinking about ways to support student participation when they're in that meeting can be uncomfortable. Sometimes the adults in the room have to think more about how they say things because, we do want to have a positive environment. But thinking about giving the student an equal voice during the meeting, giving them an opportunity to speak and share their views. Ask them questions and request feedback directly from the students. It's easy to fall into asking the parents and forgetting to ask the student. And sometimes for parents, they can fall into just answering instead of letting the student. So really try and keep that communication open for them. And that might be something, if you had a facilitator in the meeting, that they might be able to support as well. As always, we always want to listen for understanding in the meetings, but especially listening to our students, some of whom may have more difficulty communicating. And so we really do want to listen and try and make sure that we understand. Focus on their strengths rather than their limitations. Use accessible language. Again, these are all helpful tips for everyone, but a student may not be familiar with a lot of the IEP terms or some of the things we're talking about. So try and make sure you're using accessible language and maintain that positive tone. You may have heard about student-centered planning, and so we want to maintain student-centered planning in transition. That means that the students are actively involved in the planning, communicating, evaluating the progress toward meeting their post-secondary goals, making sure that the transition services are based on their strengths, preference, and interests. And then the transition goals are more meaningful when students are engaged in creating them, and then they will be more engaged in working toward them. We focus a lot in transition on self-determination. If you haven't heard about self-determination, it's really sort of that ability to make decisions and set goals and work toward them in your future. And you really want to start self-determination from a young age and be building those skills all along. And hopefully adolescents are refining skills that they've started before, doing things like making choices, expressing preferences, working to solve problems, engaging in making decisions, and then setting and working toward their goals, self-management, self-regulation, self-advocacy, and acquiring self-awareness and self-knowledge. And so there's a lot of research on self-determination, a lot of information on these aspects of self-determination. But sometimes you don't necessarily have to talk about self-determination specifically. I guess we do a lot, but I have one of my kids is very self-determined, but has no idea what self-determination means. So sometimes you can, wear it as much as like describing it specifically. So you really want to work on the opportunities and working toward these skills. And we do find that students receiving special education services on IEPs typically have self-determination and goal attainment skills that are not as strong as their peers without disabilities. And so that's why we have such a focus on it. But there's research that also shows that students can build more self-determination in this IEP transition process. And so that's an important part of working with them to develop the plan and evaluating their progress and making adjustments as needed. Some schools do student-directed IEPs, and this is where the student takes a more active role in the IEP meeting and the IEP process. Teachers will work with the students to prepare for the IEP meeting. They may have a template. Some students will do a presentation. It can vary. If your school doesn't do student-directed IEPs, you could still have that be part of your student's IEP, that they have a student-directed IEP meeting. Again, it can help build that self-determination and help them be more engaged in the process. And parents can also have an important role of being a bridge to improve communication as the student navigates that process. I know I'm a parent of a student, and sometimes they will give the briefest answer possible just because communication is hard and that's easier. And so sometimes they might not give a complete answer, or sometimes they might think they've communicated something, but you can maybe sense that they didn't communicate what they thought they did. And so that's another way that parents can really support the process, by kind of noticing those gaps and helping fill those in. Not speaking for the student, but enhancing what they've said. So Allison's going to tell us a little bit about those transition assessments, which are required as part of the process.
Thanks, Anne. So what is a transition assessment? Well, they are required by IDEA and should be age appropriate, address areas related to training, education, employment, and when appropriate, independent living skills. Next slide. Transition assessments are conducted as an ongoing process to gather information about a student's strengths, preferences, interests, and needs as they relate to post-secondary education, employment, and independent living. These assessments can be formal or informal. They might involve interviews, surveys, observations, and family members may also be asked for information to supplement and expand the student's assessment data, as Anne was just mentioning. Next slide. As mentioned, post-secondary transition covers three main categories: education training, which assesses academic strengths, educational needs, and communication skills. Employment looks at a student's interest, vocational skills, soft skills, and work-related values. And the third area is independent living, covering a student's social, behavioral, and life skills. Next slide. Transition assessments results provide information to the team on a student's present levels and identifies needs for the future. They are used to identify appropriate measurable goals and transition services. And as Anne mentioned, having students be a part of this process does help to build and develop a student's self-determination skills. Next slide. And recognizing that every student's path is different, kids vary in what they know, what they want to do, and how prepared they are. A student's goals may be related to self-awareness or exploration, or exposure of opportunities, or preparation. I think Anne's going to talk about now some tools to support that.
All right, thank you, Allison. And as part of our work in the ADR project is, we're really trying to provide tools and to really increase collaboration in the process. And we love feedback too. And so if you, in your experience, are like, this would be easier if I had this, we love to hear that kind of feedback as well. But I want to start with just the importance of having a vision of what you're working toward. And this is one tool. There are many out there, and the important thing is to find a tool that works for you. I like this. This is just one tool of kind of a library of tools that Charting the Life course has. But I like kind of the simplicity of this framework to kind of think about, what do we not want in our future and what do we want to have in the future. And, you can look at now and think, I would love for this to continue and I would like this to go away, and kind of help help you think about what you want to work toward in the future. And always we want to have a long-term vision of what we're working toward. IDEA really looks toward preparing for further education, employment, and independent living. But think about from your family and for your student, what do you want their life to look about like, because that's even broader than the IEP. And so this is just one tool you can use to think about that trajectory. And as I mentioned, we want to think beyond the IEP. When we leave, I sometimes think of K-12 or K through age 21 as it's almost a bubble. You have this place where you go to and you have a lot of support and a lot of people that are interested in what you're doing, and then you leave. And for a lot of our students, that is a very different experience after you leave that. And so think about, as you're moving toward transition from high school, what do you want to build that's going to be there when they leave? And so you can build those relationships and community experiences as you're moving toward transition. Sometimes people call it the cliff. They have some other names, what it's like to leave the school system. And so being aware that that's how a lot of people experience it, what can we do to make that transition a little more gentle? So as a family, how can you work toward your vision beyond the IEP? What is it you really want your students or your child's life to look like in the future? There's so much research now on the importance of relationships, and those people kind of supporting all of us throughout our lives is really important. And keeping in mind that many IEP post-second goals are oriented toward work, including training, education, because that continuing education is in general working toward employment. But there's other aspects of life, and what can the family do to build out those? And this is just a diagram. There's a book called Designing Your Life, and they look at play, work, love, and health. And so we want to be thinking about all those areas as a family, and thinking of the IEP and transition plan as a really, really important tool in working toward that future life, but also recognizing that we want to be building these other aspects of life too. There is an initiative called the Colorado Sequencing of Services Interagency Initiative, and there's a link in the slides for that. And they've identified 6 core outcomes. So thinking about these 6 core outcomes can be helpful in planning, and it also can be helpful in having common language. There are several sites that are piloting the sequencing of services programs where different agencies are working together. So you may be in an area where this is available. But the 6 core outcomes that they identified are self-determination and leadership, community participation, post-secondary options, computer and digital literacy, competitive employment, and disability and health management. So those are all areas you want to be thinking about as your student is moving forward, but also recognizing that they are where they are, and we can't necessarily, we want to work on everything. We want them to be as prepared as possible, but also sometimes we have to be mindful of their capacity and what they can work on at that point. It can be helpful because as Allison mentioned, they will be asking for parent input at different points, but it's also good just to have this awareness of where you are. And so use opportunities at home to learn and practice life skills. If your child's not doing their own laundry, it's a great time. Now is a great time to have them start, whatever age they are. But you can use, there's a link to a life skills checklist. And again, this is just one life skills checklist. There are many, but this can just be a way to get a sense of where your youth or young adult is now and what they might want to work on. And sometimes there's just things you can easily work into, like, have a fun cooking night or something. Your school team may have a checklist that they use. And then think about what you can do at home and what might be better done at school. Again, we only have so much time and energy at school, and so there might be something that you're like, we don't need, they're not there yet, but we can take care of it. And think about how you want to use that time. One of the tools that the ADR project offers is a parent input form. This parent input is so important for the entire IEP process. And there is a section of the IEP where you actually can share your parent input. And that's a place where you can talk about, you can highlight things that you think the evaluation doesn't show, things you want people to be aware of, things your students grade at, things, that really help them overcome challenges and things. So this is just a form to help you organize your thoughts so that you can share that both to add to that section on parent and student input, but also sort of to frame your thinking as you work through the goals and develop the IEP. That is a form that's for any IEP meeting. And so we've also created a transition input form to kind of think about these other goals, including post-secondary education, employment and vocational interests, thinking about community participation, independent living skills, and self-determination. And so these are just tools, again, that can help you sort of organize that thoughts. We hope that families will be thinking about what's important throughout the year. The IEP team meets once a year, or if you need to have other meetings, you'll meet more. But you want to be thinking about this stuff throughout the process. And so kind of having a way to keep track of your notes and your thoughts could be helpful. And it's very easy to get distracted in the IEP meeting. So having these notes written down can kind of be a reminder to bring up the things that you want to bring up. So some key takeaways. We hope that you understand transition planning for IEP purposes. And again, that's secondary transition planning. We encourage working in partnership with the school team. Be proactive in helping the student to have as much information and experience as possible related to transition. And that can start at the youngest ages. We want, students will be asked a lot of questions when they're in high school and trying to move forward. And so the more things they've experienced, the more meaningful those answers can be, because sometimes students haven't had as much experience and they'll think one thing, but maybe they really haven't thought that through, or but then maybe they'll go down that path and maybe there's something they would have liked better. So really think about how to expand, increase exposure to different types of opportunities. Prepare for meaningful participation in IEP meetings. So you're not just saying what comes to your mind in that moment, to kind of try to be thoughtful and bringing in information you've seen. And then really support the student in engaging in the transition process and participating in IEP meetings. And that's another thing that sometimes if you start things earlier, it can become more of a habit, and students sometimes become less eager to engage with us as they get older. It varies depending on the students, but take advantage of that time they want to spend with you when you have it. I want to highlight some resources. These are statewide resources for one-to-one family support. I often hear people say things like, I wish there was someone I could call and ask a question about what's happening with my IEP. So if you take nothing else away, please keep in mind that you can call these numbers and ask any question that you have. So CDE has a family question line, and families, educators, professionals can call, and the phone number and email are there. At Peak Parent Center, we have parent advisors who are available for one-to-one support. The phone number and email is there. And again, you can call them and ask about your situation. You can say, I'm curious about this, because they've talked to a lot of families. They know about a lot of resources. They have training and things. So the one thing that I think CDE is specific to IDEA and special education. At Peak, if you want to know about resources in the community and things, that may be the choice for that. I also want to tell you about Show and Tell. Show and Tell is a community parent resource center. So it's very similar to Peak Parent Center, which is a parent training and information center. The IDEA requires each state to have at least one parent training and information center. So Peak is that for the state of Colorado. And they also designate throughout the country CPRCs, sometimes for a specific metropolitan area, sometimes for specific populations. So Show and Tell serves the Denver metro area, and they are they especially work with families who are BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, and people of color. But any family in the Denver metro area can call them, and their information is here. So they also have parent advising workshops and assistance finding resources. Just a few resources to highlight. Again, the CDE website has information on IEP facilitation, if that sounds like something that would be interesting for you. We, as part of our project at Peak Parent Center, we have a page of our website dedicated to our ADR resources. Keeping in mind the importance of this transition, the Office of Special Education Programs has a relatively new initiative called Expect, Engage, Empower, and they are really encouraging everyone to have high expectations and to start working on building those skills from an early age. And as I mentioned, charting the life courses and the sequencing of services initiative. And I just want to highlight Family Voices Colorado as the Family to Family Health Information Center for Colorado. So if you have questions relating to health or to Medicaid waivers, that's a great resource. And as I mentioned, if you are interested in learning about adult waivers, get in contact with your case management agency early. There are two main waivers for intellectual and developmental disabilities. One of those, the developmental disabilities waiver, has a wait list, and you need to get on that wait list early. And the other one is the SLS waiver, which I'm blanking on what the letter stands. But so, find out what you need to find out early. Just will make the process easier as you move through it. So this is our contact information if you have questions about this presentation. And if you want to know more about the ADR project at CDE or about special education generally, Catherine Rains is the supervisor of this project. So this is her contact information as well. So with that wraps up our presentation. I'm going to stop sharing, and oops. Sorry, I'm having Zoom trouble tonight. Hopefully you guys are still there.
We're still here.
I should be used to Zoom by now, but they keep updating it and making new things.